You're listening to the Culips English Podcast. To download the study guide for this episode, which includes the transcript, detailed vocabulary explanations, real-world examples, and a quiz, visit our website, culips.com. CULIPS.com. Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew.
And I'm Jeremy.
And you're listening to Culips. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Culips. Today, we have a Simplified Speech episode for you, which is our series where we have completely natural English conversations, but we speak just a little bit slower than we do in our everyday lives. The topic for today's episode is how to raise a child as multilingual. And this was actually a really good suggestion from one of our listeners in South Korea named Unju. And I am not a father. I don't have any children, but Jeremy does. Jeremy does have a little 2-year-old son, so I thought he would be the perfect person to come on and tackle this topic with me. So I'm here with Jeremy today. Jeremy, how is it going?
Going pretty well.
Jeremy, your son is now 2 years old. Is that correct?
Yeah, he just turned 2 about a month before the time of this recording.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine he is talking up a storm these days. Is that true?
Yes, he is quite talkative for someone his age. And Before I had kids, I didn't really understand the difference between a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. Mm-hmm. But he speaks a lot more and quite a bit better than some older kids that we've seen at the playground or in public. So he's speaking quite well.
That's good. You must be very proud.
I'm a little proud of him in that regard.
As a language teacher, right?
Exactly. As a language teacher, I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. So actually, teaching a 2-year-old how to say something is much easier than teaching a 42-year-old how to say something. He's much more receptive, and he has a much better ear for pronunciation and for sounds than most adults do when they learn a new language.
You are raising your son to be multilingual.
Correct.
And that is exactly what we're going to talk about here today. And I think you'll have a lot of interesting things to share with our listeners. But just before we dive into the topic, I do want to remind all of our listeners that there's a study guide for this episode available on our website, culips.com. So if you'd like to study along with the study guides, and we suggest that you do, just visit our website, culips.com, to check that out. Okay, Jeremy, I'm going to fire a lot of questions at you today because I have no kids and I'm not an expert about this at all. So, question number 1 is, what languages are you teaching your son?
Well, currently we are teaching him English and Korean. So he is half Korean. My wife is Korean. And so he spends time with Korean family members, and he also spends time with English-speaking family members. So we have chosen to raise him bilingually. But I also speak Spanish, and I would like to introduce Spanish a little bit later in his life, after English and Korean have solidified.
Okay, so hopefully trilingual in the future.
We shall see, but yes.
So, because I am a language teacher, I am, of course, interested in how children acquire language. And I'm also interested in how parents raise multilingual children. And there's lots of different strategies.
Yeah.
And it seems like multilingual families, they all kind of have a different approach, right? Some people only choose to speak one language at home, and then out in the real world, they speak kind of the language of that culture or that community where they live in. Other families take an approach where one parent speaks one language and the other parent speaks a different language.
Mhm.
What's your approach? What do you and your wife do with your son?
Well, before he was born, actually, I started reading about these things and how different parents do it. But even before he was born, my wife and I, we use both Korean and English in our house. So we mix them very freely. And for us, they're kind of like one big language. So when I started thinking about, how are we going to teach our son these languages? I felt like the most natural thing for us to do would be to just mix them with him as well. Now, a lot of the articles and things that I read about this topic said that can confuse children or that it can delay their speaking. So sometimes they'll start speaking when they're older, 3 or 4, or even later sometimes. But I sort of had a different approach.
Okay.
So my initial approach was to teach him that Korean is harmony. So harmony is the word in Korean for grandma. So we call the Korean grandparents 할머니 and 할아버지.
Grandma and grandpa.
So we use that word for those parents because with them, he uses Korean. And with my parents, they are grandma and grandpa in English. So my strategy is over time to teach him that you say this word to grandma and you say this word to harmony. So when we teach him a new word, usually a concrete noun, so an object, ball, cup, things like this, we teach him both words for that object at the same time as one word.
Do you think he's distinguishing between the two languages at this point? Does he realize that Korean is a unique language and English is a unique language? Or does he just kind of think it's one big language soup?
And that's a very good question. I think it is kind of one big language soup for him, but I have noticed him translate in certain situations from Korean to English. So the Korean word for flower is 꽃. And he was with my mom, with grandma, and he pointed to a flower and said, 꽃, grandma, 꽃. And she didn't, she looked at him strangely, and then he said, flower, after that. And he's done this like 2 or 3 times with other words. So we're just now seeing that he's sort of able to distinguish between the two. But today I asked him something in Korean, a simple question, and he just stared at me. And then I asked him the same question in English, and he answered right away. So his sentence structure is still sort of developed in English than it is in Korean for him.
That's really interesting. I was curious about that, whether he would try to speak Korean with non-Korean people or if he had just limited it to Koreans. So that's really interesting that he tried to speak it with your mother.
We went to Mexico recently, and you and I made an episode about that. And while we were there, he learned some of the commonly used phrases, gracias, adios, words like this. And hola, we taught him hola a long time ago, which is the word for hello. And a couple times I've noticed him say that to people who look Mexican.
Okay.
There was a handyman who came to our apartment to fix something, and he was Mexican. I heard him speaking Spanish, and my son saw him and looked at him and said, "Hola." And we started laughing because we thought, how could this 2-year-old know? So I do think that he is able to distinguish the difference a little bit, but I plan to keep emphasizing to him, this one is Korean, this one is English. And then these days we are asking him things like, what is the other word for 비행기? And he says, airplane. And we say, what's the other word for airplane? And he says, 비행기. So that's what we're doing now to help him make pairs, connections between the equivalent words.
What about the media that he is exposed to? So if he's watching TV, I don't know if you let him watch TV or movies.
We don't have TV.
Or if you read him books.
We do read him books, yeah. We read him
Okay.
books in Korean and English, or different, English books and Korean books.
Okay.
And he learns a lot from these books. There's one book right now, the title is a full sentence in Korean, and when he wants to read that book, he says, 커튼 뒤에 누가 있어요? Because that's the name of the book.
Okay.
So he is learning a lot from picture books right now.
So I think many of our listeners want their children to grow up speaking English. But the issue that they have is that they are English learners themselves. So they're trying to teach their kids languages that they don't speak natively. And essentially, you're doing this as well, right?
Yes.
You're teaching your son Korean, but you're not a Korean native speaker. You are a second language Korean speaker. So is there any strategy or any tips that you could give our listeners who want to raise their kids to speak English, even though they're not native speakers themselves, and even though they're not in a English-speaking country?
I would say the easiest way is to sing songs together that are in that language.
Okay.
And especially if there are common songs that have a translation. So like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, there is a Korean version and an English version, and he knows both of them and sings along to both of them. So songs are a very fun way to expose the children to new bits of language. Also, of course, storybooks. Storybooks are very, very valuable because they have pictures that show you the context. So a message to our listeners, if you have a child and you want to expose your child to English, I think there are 3 things that you could do to help them get used to English.
Okay.
The first is to sing songs in English with them that you also sing in your native language.
Okay.
Because songs are fun regardless of the lyrics, right? So they catch their attention, exactly. The other would be to read books in English to your child. And this is also a good exercise for you. If you are learning English, reading the same storybook 12 times will really benefit your language learning as well.
I'm going to interject here and ask you another question. Would you suggest that parents read the books themselves, or should they listen to audiobooks together and hear native pronunciation? What's your thoughts on that?
Personally, my pronunciation in Korean is quite good from what I've heard, so I don't worry about that myself.
Okay.
But I do try extra hard to pronounce things properly when I read the Korean books. I also listen to my wife and copy what she says sometimes. But there are plenty of YouTube channels and YouTube videos where there are people reading storybooks to children for you. And this could also be a good exercise if your child likes that book and likes the story. But I think most children just want to do something with mommy or daddy. They want to spend time with mommy and daddy. And so reading it to them, I think, is a good option. It benefits everyone. And that leads to my third recommendation, which is to let your child know that you are studying English, or let your child see that you are learning English. As children get older, I've heard that they learn more from what you do than from what you say.
Mm-hmm.
So they will copy your behavior, but they might not listen to what you tell them to do.
Right.
So if they see you learning English and curious about English and watching movies in English or speaking English with other English speakers, then they will likely copy you and develop an interest in English as well.
From a lot of stories that I've heard, being a positive role model plays a huge part, right? So how are you going to convince your children to do something if you're not into it?
Exactly.
If you're not being a good role model and being open to learning English and being interested in learning English, I think your kids are going to pick up on that and they'll probably model your behavior. So I think that's a really good point, Jeremy, that you should create a good environment where English is respected in the household. It's not seen as a chore. You know, it's something that you're passionate about. Your passion will probably rub off on your kids in some way or another. And it may not look like that at first.
Yeah.
But
like currently, my son isn't using Korean to communicate very often. He communicates by putting words together, but sometimes he mixes both languages. But he mostly uses English sentence order. So now I've noticed that he has a weakness in Korean, and I'm trying to focus on using Korean with him to help develop that language for him. But I think overall, the most important thing is that your child has to want to use English or need to use English. So maybe you could play a game with them where they can only speak English. If they speak your native language during that game, then mommy pretends that she can't understand, right? Creating situations in which the children need the language will encourage them to learn it on their own. And children are natural learners. So if they want to learn, then they will learn.
Jeremy, I'm sure you're familiar with this guy. His name is Son Hyun-woo.
Oh, of course.
He's a very famous Korean language teacher, but he's got a very fascinating YouTube channel where he is raising his kids to be English speakers in Korea. So I'm sorry for all of the listeners out there that, you know, don't have a connection to Korea. Maybe we're sort of heavily focused on Korean and English today, but I think this is applicable to any language. So he is not a native English speaker. He actually learned how to speak English while living in Korea, and he has two sons who he is raising to be bilingual. And I think his children are a bit older than your son. They're maybe 4 and 8 or something like that, if I had to guess. And he has documented pretty extensively their language learning journey so far. And it's really, really interesting to watch how he raises his children to be English speakers in the foreign language environment of South Korea. So any parents out there that want to learn more about this topic, I would recommend checking out his channel. We'll be sure to put the link to his YouTube channel in the podcast notes for this episode so that if you're interested in learning more about this topic and checking out his videos, you can do that easily.
I think that everyone has to find a method that works for them, My personal situation is different from most people's. My wife is a native Korean speaker and I am a native English speaker. And so we can raise our children bilingually because we are both bilingual. But sometimes that isn't possible. So we all have to do the best we can with what we have. So I just think the most important thing to remember is to make sure your children like English or want to speak English. They have to see it as valuable. And if they do, then they will learn it. But everything I've ever seen tells me that forcing them to learn English does not work.
Forcing them does not work. And Jeremy, I know we're going on a little long here, but I have one final question for you.
Okay.
And that's because I've heard that something that is really negative that you can do is be embarrassed to speak your target language in public in front of your children. So for example, if you were out at the grocery store in front of a lot of other Americans and you were speaking Korean to your child, but you were kind of embarrassed to do this or ashamed, this could have a negative impact on the language development because you're communicating to your child that this is something to be ashamed about. How do you feel when you're in public in front of other Americans speaking Korean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Personally, it doesn't bother me because I know people will look at us strangely or think, what? Where are they from? But at least where I live in California, this is a very diverse area. And so I see it as a positive thing that I am raising my son to be more worldly, to be a more multicultural person. And so I personally don't feel very embarrassed about that. However, I have read articles about Americans telling parents not to speak another language to their child. Some old lady walks over to the mom and says, "Don't speak Spanish to your child. It'll just confuse her."
Right.
And that would make me very angry if someone told me that.
Well, Jeremy, thanks for sharing some of your insights here. As we mentioned, your son's only 2, so maybe we can come back to this topic next year. Each year that he ages, there'll be a different stage and different challenges in his language development, and it would be cool to hear some updates from you. So maybe a year from now, we can revisit this topic and see how it's going.
Sure, let's do it.
Thank you for listening, everyone. Once again, our website is culips.com. You can get the study guide for this episode there and also listen to our other English lessons that we have created. There are over 500 of them available to listen to on culips.com. And thank you again to Unju for the suggestion for this episode. It was a really great topic suggestion. And guys, if you have any other topics that you would like to hear us talk about in the future, just send us an email. Our email address is contact@culips.com. That's it for us. We will be back soon with another brand new episode, and we'll talk to you then. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.